At 11:23 a.m. on August 13, 1945, First Lieutenant Oscar Perdomo threw his P-47N Thunderbolt into a hard left bank over Keijo, Korea, and watched 5 Japanese fighters peel out of formation 8,000 feet below. He was 26 years old. He'd flown 9 combat missions and had 0 kills. The son of a Mexican immigrant who once rode with Pancho Villa was about to erase that record in the next 4 minutes. More than 50 Japanese aircraft had climbed to meet 38 American Thunderbolts over what would later be called Seoul. The Americans were outnumbered, roughly 750 miles from home, and the war everyone assumed would drag on for another year was actually about 48 hours from ending. Nobody in either formation knew that yet. The atomic bombs had already fallen, Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. At that very moment, Emperor Hirohito was in conference with his war council, weighing surrender. But over Korea, Japanese pilots were still launching, American pilots were still hunting, and Perdomo was already pushing nose down toward 3 fighters trailing behind the enemy group, 8.50 caliber machine guns, armed and ready. His Thunderbolt carried a nickname painted on its nose, Lil Meaty's Meat Chopper. The nose art showed a diapered baby chewing on a cigar, derby hat on his head, a rifle in his hands, an homage to his infant son Kenneth waiting back in Los Angeles. Perdomo had no way of knowing if he would ever make it home to see that boy again. The day's mission was built to be brutal. 8 hours in the air, a 1,500-mile round trip, most of it over open ocean, where a single engine failure could be a death sentence. The P-47N had been designed for exactly that kind of work. Republic Aviation reworked the Thunderbolt for the Pacific, including wet wings that could hold 93 gallons of fuel in each wing root. With external tanks, the aircraft could carry more than 200 gallons. It had the reach to escort B-29 superfortresses to Japan and back, and the punch to shred almost anything it could catch. 8 Browning machine guns, 3,000 rounds, a 2,800 horsepower Pratt & Whitney radial engine that could haul a 7-ton fighter past 460 miles per hour. But none of that mattered if you couldn't find the enemy. For 6 weeks, the 57th Fighter Group had been flying mission after mission from their base on Ieshima, a tiny island a few miles northwest of Okinawa. They escorted bombers, strafed airfields, burned fuel, dropped ordnance, again and again on targets that rarely fired back. The Japanese, people said, were holding their planes in reserve, saving them for the invasion everyone expected. Pilots joked the enemy must have simply run out of aircraft. August 13th proved them wrong. Mission 507-35 launched 53 Thunderbolts at dawn. 15 turned back, mechanical trouble, navigation problems. The remaining 38 droned northwest across the East China Sea, crossed the Korean coastline, and approached Keijo when radar reported contacts. Not just a few, lots of them. Japanese units, the 22nd and 85th Sentais, had scrambled everything they could. Nakajima Ki 84 Frank fighters, Nakajima Ki 43 Oscars, even a pair of Yokosuka K-5Y Willow trainers that somehow ended up in the wrong patch of sky. And if you want to see how Perdomo's meat chopper earned its name that morning, tap like right now. It helps push these forgotten stories to more viewers. And if you're new here, subscribe. Now back to Perdomo. He picked out the 3 trailing fighters on purpose. It was standard practice. Hit the rear aircraft first. The leaders wouldn't even realize they were under attack until their wingmen started burning. Perdomo shoved the throttle forward, felt the Thunderbolt surge, and watched the gap collapse. 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,000. At about 800 yards, he settled the gun sight on the nearest fighter and squeezed the trigger. The war was nearing its end, and Perdomo was about to become the last pilot in history to down 5 aircraft in a single day. He also had only about 4 minutes of ammunition left. His first burst landed exactly where he aimed, engine cowling, cockpit. The Japanese fighter bucked, spit black smoke, and rolled into a spiraling fall toward the Korean countryside far below. Perdomo didn't linger to watch it hit. He was already swinging his sight onto the second aircraft. 9 missions without a kill. 6 weeks of escorts, strafing runs, and empty sky. Now the enemy was finally here, and Perdomo learned something about himself in an instant. He could do this. And not just adequately. He was frighteningly good. The Ki-84 Frank was considered Japan's best fighter by August 1945. Faster than the Zero, heavier armed, able to climb with American machines that had dominated the Pacific for 2 years. Japanese pilots called it the Gale. Allied intelligence rated it as one of the rare enemy fighters that could contest American air superiority on something close to equal terms. The men flying over Korea that morning included some of Japan's most seasoned pilots. None of it mattered once 8.50 caliber guns found their mark. The second target tried to snap away to the right. It was too late and too slow. A fully loaded P-47N weighed close to 20,000 pounds. It couldn't carve tight turns like a Japanese fighter, and it wouldn't outclimb one either. But it could dive like nothing else in the sky. And if a Thunderbolt caught you from above and behind, the math became simple. Speed plus firepower plus surprise meant destruction. Rounds stitched across the Frank's fuselage. Perdomo saw pieces tear loose, wing section, tail fragments. Then the fuel ignited, and the fighter became a tumbling fireball toward the earth. 2 kills in under a minute. The third pilot had seen enough. He rolled inverted and dove for the deck, trying to run. Perdomo let him go. The Thunderbolt had the speed to chase, but chasing one fleeing aircraft meant losing sight of the larger fight. Somewhere above Korea, 37 other American pilots were tangled with 50-plus Japanese planes. Perdomo needed to find his squadron. He pulled into a climbing turn, scanning for the chunky silhouettes of friendly Thunderbolts. The sun made identification difficult. Aircraft twisted and fell away in every direction. Smoke trails carved lines across the sky. Below, at least 3 parachutes drifted down. American or Japanese, he couldn't tell. The fuel gauge added its own pressure. 8 hours total flight time. Every minute of combat burned fuel at roughly 3 times the cruise rate. The external tanks were already gone, dropped before the engagement, so he was running on internal fuel only, and the return to Ieshima would take close to 4 hours. The numbers were cruel and uncomplicated. Then he saw movement, down low, around 800 feet. 2 aircraft flying close together, tracking northeast. For a moment, he didn't trust his eyes. The shapes weren't combat fighters. They were trainers. Yokosuka K-5Y Willows, canvas-covered biplanes from another era. Why they were in the middle of an air battle over Korea made no tactical sense. It didn't matter. They carried Japanese markings, and that made them targets. Perdomo rolled inverted and dove, building speed for the intercept. The biplanes spotted him and split apart, each pilot choosing a different escape line. Perdomo took the nearer one and opened fire. A Willow topped out around 132 miles per hour. The P-47N was diving at more than 400. The whole engagement lasted about 3 seconds. He watched the biplane ignite, corkscrew down and smash into the ground in a column of black smoke, his 3rd kill of the morning. He searched for the second Willow but couldn't find it, either swallowed by cloud or lost against the terrain. He checked his ammo counters. The numbers had fallen sharply. 3 kills had eaten almost half his rounds. The meat chopper still had teeth, but they were wearing down. He climbed again, pushing above the cloud tops, looking for friendlies. What he found instead was an ambush. 4 Japanese fighters waited at higher altitude. 4 Ki-84 Franks with the advantage. They had watched the Thunderbolt climb through the clouds and set themselves perfectly. Sun behind them, speed building, the classic bounce that had killed hundreds of Allied pilots across the Pacific. Perdomo saw them at the last instant. 4 shapes diving out of glare, swelling fast, maybe 2 seconds to react. 2 seconds to decide whether his son would ever see him again. He didn't run. Running from a diving attack meant taking rounds in the engine or cockpit. A P-47 could absorb punishment, but not 4 attackers firing together. So Perdomo did the one thing that felt wrong to every instinct. He turned into them. The move shocked the Japanese formation. They expected him to dive away or brake hard to escape. Instead, the Thunderbolt climbed toward them, nose high, speed bleeding off. For a heartbeat, all 4 attackers had to correct their aim. That heartbeat was enough. Perdomo rolled onto his back and hauled the stick, reversing direction as the Japanese fighters screamed past and overshot, their dive speed carrying them down and beyond, exactly as he intended. Now the geometry flipped. Hunters became targets. He chose the trailing Frank and fired. The pilot never saw the tracers. .50 caliber rounds ripped through the engine section and the fighter detonated into a roaring ball of flame. 4 kills. Oscar Perdomo was now an ace, earned not over months, not after dozens of sorties, but inside a single engagement that lasted under 5 minutes. The other 3 Franks scattered. 1 dove low, 1 climbed for cloud, 1 tried to wheel around for another pass. Perdomo ignored them. His ammo was nearly gone, maybe 30 seconds of firing time left. He had to find his squadron and start the long flight home. The sky over Keijo had turned into bedlam. Smoke rose from crash sites. Aircraft spun at every altitude, some still fighting, others just trying to survive. Then he spotted them. 2 P-47Ns around 3,000 feet, their big paddle blade propellers catching sunlight. Friendlies. He banked toward them and then saw what they were dealing with. A single Ki-84 had latched onto the tail of one Thunderbolt and would not let go. The American pilot jinked violently, trying to shake him, but the Japanese fighter matched every move. The second Thunderbolt tried to help, but the angles were wrong. Every time the wingman lined up a shot, his squadron mate slid into the line of fire. Perdomo shoved the throttle forward and dove into the fight. The meat chopper had perhaps 20 seconds of ammunition left, maybe less. It would have to be enough. He attacked the same way he'd attacked before, down from above and behind. The Ki-84 pilot was locked onto his victim, watching the Thunderbolt fill his gun sight, waiting for the perfect trigger moment. He never checked his 6. He never saw Perdomo dropping in at 400 miles per hour. Perdomo pressed the trigger and held it. Tracers reached across open sky and converged on the Japanese fighter. Impacts flickered along the fuselage. The Ki-84 shuddered. Smoke poured from the engine, and then the guns stopped. Not a stutter, not a tapering burst. Total silence. All 8 Brownings were empty at the same instant. 3,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, enough firepower to tear apart a small building, had been burned away in under 6 minutes of combat. The Ki-84 was hurt, but it was still flying. Smoke streamed behind it, yet it remained under control. The Japanese pilot, suddenly realizing he'd been attacked from a new direction, broke off his pursuit and turned toward Perdomo. Now Perdomo was alone in hostile sky, 750 miles from home. He had 0 rounds left. A damaged enemy fighter was still dangerous, and it still had guns. Most pilots would have run. The math demanded it. Dive low, use the Thunderbolt speed, stretch the distance, get back to base, live to fight another day. Oscar Perdomo didn't run. The Ki-84 completed its turn and lined up an attack. The Japanese pilot could see the distinctive checkered cowling of the 57th Fighter Group. He couldn't know the American in front of him had spent every last round. From his perspective, it was simply one more enemy aircraft to kill. Perdomo watched the Frank steady for its firing pass. Smoke still boiled from the wounded engine, but the plane held together. The Japanese pilot had guns. Perdomo did not. The next 60 seconds would come down to nothing but skill, nerve, and how willing a man was to die. He rolled his Thunderbolt straight toward the Ki-84 as if he still had a full belt of ammunition. Tactically, it was madness. An unarmed fighter charging a pilot who could still shoot. But Perdomo understood the one thing the numbers couldn't measure. The Japanese pilot had no idea the American guns were empty. All he saw was a P-47 coming nose to nose at a combined closing speed that felt like 800 miles an hour. It turned into aerial chicken, one of the most lethal games a pilot could play. The Ki-84 pilot blinked first. His engine was already smoking, and with what looked like an armed Thunderbolt boring in, he broke hard to the right and abandoned his firing run. Perdomo stayed glued to him, turning inside the Japanese fighter and keeping the posture aggressive. Every second he forced the enemy to defend was a second his squadron mates could use to get clear, or to rejoin the fight. Perdomo hit the radio and called for help. In the chaos overhead, another P-47 pilot caught the transmission and understood instantly. A friendly was engaged and needed support. The reply came fast. Meanwhile, Perdomo kept the bluff alive. Turn, counter-turn, shallow dive, quick climb, again and again swinging the Thunderbolt's empty gun ports onto the Ki-84 just to make the Japanese pilot react. He knew it couldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the Ki-84 pilot would notice the lack of tracers and realize he was being chased by a man with an empty hand. But help arrived before that realization could settle in. A second Thunderbolt dropped out of the clouds at full power, the pilot reading the geometry in a glance and sliding into position for a clean, decisive shot. The Ki-84 never saw him. The Japanese pilot was fixated on Perdomo, who had been hounding him for the past minute and a half. Then 8.50 caliber machine guns erupted at once. The Ki-84 came apart under the concentrated barrage, wings tearing away, the fuselage splitting, the engine ripping free and tumbling end over end. What was left scattered across the Korean sky as burning fragments. That made 5. Oscar Perdomo had just done what only a tiny fraction of American pilots managed in the entire war. 5 victories in a single day. And he had done it on what would become one of the last days it was even possible to do it. Officially, the label wouldn't stick until intelligence officers reviewed the gun camera film back at Ieshima, but the story was already written in the smoke trails over Korea. When the film was finally run through the projectors, it cleared up the confusion. The first 4 fighters he destroyed weren't the older Ki-43 Oscar type people initially reported. They were Ki-84 Franks. The footage also captured the bizarre moment of the Willow trainer biplane wandering into the wrong battle, and it showed the final chase. The damaged Ki-84 that Perdomo attacked drove off its victim and harassed long enough for a squadron mate to finish. All 5 victories were credited to him. The camera didn't argue. But Perdomo's danger wasn't finished just because the fighting had ended. He was still roughly 750 miles from home. His fuel gauges were no longer forgiving, and there were still Japanese aircraft in the sky that wanted him dead. The morning was only halfway done. The return trip was the part that killed pilots, even when the enemy didn't. Between Korea and Ieshima lay hundreds of miles of open water, no landmarks, no emergency fields, no easy rescue if an engine quit. A man who ran out of fuel over the East China Sea had 2 choices, and neither was good. Ditch and pray for a pickup that might never come, or stay with the airplane and die on impact. Perdomo checked his gauges and did the arithmetic every Pacific pilot learned to do without thinking. Fuel remaining, distance left, burn rate at cruise power. The numbers could work, but only if nothing went wrong. Any detour, any extended climb, any extra throttle would turn barely into never. Over the Korean coastline, the 57th Fighter Group began pulling itself back together. Thunderbolts drifted in from every direction, some trailing smoke, others showing jagged battle damage. Squadron leaders ran radio checks, counting aircraft, sorting out who was still airborne and who was missing. The fight had scattered the formation across miles of sky. By the time the dust settled, American pilots had brought down about 20 Japanese aircraft. The 57th hadn't lost any in the engagement itself. It was the kind of lopsided result commanders dreamed about, the kind of victory that triggered citations and medal recommendations. Yet the mission still wasn't complete. Everyone still had to make it home. Perdomo slid into a loose stream of P-47s heading southeast. They cruised around 12,000 feet, high enough to glide toward land if an engine faltered, low enough to conserve fuel. The radio stayed quiet. Pilots watched instruments, stared at fuel needles, and counted minutes, waiting for Aishima to appear. Below them, the sea was an endless gray-blue sheet. August heat kicked up rough air that bumped the heavy fighters without warning. Perdomo trimmed the airplane for efficiency, managed throttle and mixture like his life depended on it, and let the autopilot hold course while his hands rested and his mind replayed what had just happened. 5 kills in one morning sounded unreal. 9 missions of empty sky, and then 6 minutes of concentrated violence that felt like a lifetime. He could still picture the tracer streams, still see aircraft catch fire, still feel the Thunderbolt shudder as thousands of rounds poured through 8 gun barrels. Eventually, the gun camera footage would lock it all down. Film didn't bend to ego or memory. Intelligence officers would go through it frame by frame, linking each burst to each aircraft destroyed. That process could take days, sometimes longer. Until the review was done, every victory was still officially a claim, and every pilot in the war made claims. Not all of them could prove them. A couple of hours into the return flight, the horizon began to change. Okinawa appeared as a faint shape, and Ieshima lay just beyond it. A flat patch of coral and sand that had become a home for fighter groups and the machinery that kept them flying. The island had seen plenty of death. The famous war correspondent Ernie Pyle had been killed there months earlier, and his marker stood near the beaches where Marines had fought their way ashore. Now the same island functioned like an unsinkable carrier, launching strikes day after day toward Japan. Perdomo's fuel needles were nearly pinned at empty as the runway finally filled his windscreen. Other pilots reported the same. The mission had pushed the P-47N to the edge of what it could do. Another 50 miles and the sky would have been full of ditchings and funerals. They entered the pattern. One by one, wheels down, flaps set, final approach over the coastline. Perdomo brought the Thunderbolt onto the coral strip and felt the landing gear take the weight. 8 hours and 18 minutes after takeoff, mission 507-35 was over. He taxied toward the hardstand where his crew chief waited. The crew chief's eyes went straight to the gun ports, looking for the black carbon streaks that meant combat. There was no shortage of residue. Then he looked up at Perdomo's face and knew something different had happened. In debrief, the room packed with pilots, still in flight gear, still smelling of fuel and sweat and cordite. Intelligence officers moved between them, collecting first reports, comparing stories, writing down details while memories were still fresh. The total, around 20 Japanese aircraft destroyed, sounded too big until you remembered how many men had seen it with their own eyes. Perdomo sat in a folding chair and laid it out plainly. 5 enemy aircraft, 4 fighters and a trainer. The intelligence officer wrote without looking up. Initial paperwork went in immediately. Confirmation would wait for the film. The context mattered. The 57th had only entered combat in early July 1945. Weeks of missions had produced almost no air opposition. The Japanese had been conserving aircraft, saving strength, preparing for an invasion planners on both sides believed would cost millions of lives. Then came August 13th, and the calculus flipped. The 57th ran into the largest concentration of Japanese fighters they would ever face. The result was a one-sided victory on a scale that almost didn't look real. Roughly 20 enemy aircraft for no American losses in that fight. That kind of ratio earned unit citations and stacks of recommendations, even though